So this is the third video on the Power and the People course, and we will be looking at the Peasants Revolt of 1381, the first popular uprising in English history. Now, to give you some background of England at the time, the 14th century was a very, very bad time to be alive. It's sometimes referred to as the worst century ever. Why? Well, throughout the 1300s, you have poor harvests, famines, war, and increasing social inequality. And then to top it all off, in 1348, a disease called the Black Death arrived in the south of England. This was the most horrific thing that had ever happened to this country, because as the plague swept through England, wiping out villages and towns, it is estimated to have killed up to 50% of the population. So the Black Death was absolutely horrific. But some economic historians take a different lens on the events and try to see how it changed wages and society in England. And here is something really interesting, because after the Black Death, the number of workers in England had halved. And so for the workers that did survive, suddenly their labour became a lot more valuable because there were fewer of them to do the work. Soon the landowners would have to pay the labourers higher wages, and if the lords did not do this, well, the peasants may just leave and work for another lord who will pay them better. So many peasants also had more freedom. So strangely, just after the Black Death, peasants had more wealth and greater freedom, which was changing the balance of power between the peasants and the lords. But of course, this was something that many nobles and landowners hated. Now here we see one of the long-term causes of the Peasants' Revolt, which are the social factors. As feudal society was being challenged, the king and the government turned to the law to bring it back in order. Importantly, in 1351, the government passed the Statute of Labourers Act. This stated that all peasants had to work for the wages of pre-Black Death levels and stop workers from moving around and taking better jobs with other lords. Although this did not reflect the new economic situation in England, it was done to keep the peasants in line. In 1363, the sumptuary laws were passed, which told people what to wear and what food they could eat based on their social class. These laws became another symbol of inequality in England and caused resentment among the peasants. There was also growing criticisms of the church, and we see elements of religion as a factor in the Peasants' Revolt. The church in medieval England was of course extremely wealthy and powerful. All citizens of England were actually obliged to give 1/10 of their income to the church, as well as some extra payments for services. But as the church grew increasingly wealthy, many of the bishops and priests were living in luxury, and people started to criticise the corruption and greed of the church. You have key figures like Simon Sudbury, who was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chancellor at the same time. So he was the head of the Church of England and also in charge of managing the money of the country, which obviously stinks of corruption. An opponent to church corruption was John Bull, who was a radical priest, and he wanted to have the church broken down as well as equality between all people in England. He would later go down to be one of the leading figures in the Peasants' Revolt, as a sort of spiritual voice of the rebels. So we've mentioned some corruption within the highest positions of the church and state, and this feeds into the political background of the Peasants' Revolt. The king at the time was called a boy king because Richard II was only 10 years old when he took power in 1377. As he was so young, his uncle John of Gaunt really pulled the strings in the background and ruled England. Ordinary people despised John of Gaunt and Simon Sudbury, seen as corrupt and ruining the country. So I've given you a lot of different causes: social, religious, political, and now finally we can look at the trigger cause of the Peasants' Revolt, which was the economic factor. So it all went wrong within the first few years of Richard's reign, when the government needed to raise money to fight wars with, of course, the French. The government called for a poll tax in the name of the king. The poll tax was a flat tax imposed on every man and woman in England over the age of 14. The first poll tax was set at 4p per person, which if you're a rich noble, that's absolutely fine. But if you're just an ordinary labourer who doesn't make much money, this will proportionally hit you a lot harder. So this was quite an unfair tax on the poor in England. The government used the poll tax 3 different times between 1377 and 1381. The final poll tax was set at a flat rate of 1 shilling 4p per person, the equivalent of about 2 weeks' wages for a worker. And remember, this is on every man and woman in England, so you might have to support other people in your family who don't work but need to pay the tax anyway. The poorest in society just could not afford the poll tax, and tax collectors often used force and intimidation to collect the money. It all kicked off in May 1381, and a lot happens in a relatively short time period, so really try to follow along. So on the 30th of May, the king's tax collector went to a small village in Essex with bodyguards to collect unpaid poll taxes. The villagers refused to pay and drove them out. Word of this incident spread around Essex, and other villagers refused to pay the poll tax and started to arm themselves and band together. Meanwhile, in Kent, a separate incident occurred over an escaped serf, sparking further rebellion. Suddenly, two groups of rebels, the Essex rebels and the Kentish rebels, started to march towards London, gathering support along the way. On the 13th of June, the rebels had entered London and destroyed the Savoy Palace, the home of John of Gaunt. At this point, the rebellion had struck complete fear into the ruling class, and the following day, on the 14th of June, Richard decided to meet the Essex rebels in Mile End. Some demands were made of Richard, such as peasants having more freedom to move around the country, and Richard's advisors being handed over for execution. Richard actually agreed to these demands, but at the same time, the Kentish rebels were going crazy in the Tower of London and had beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, as well as the Lord Treasurer, Robert Hales. So the following day, Richard also agreed to meet with the Kentish rebels at Smithfield. Their leader was a man called Wat Tyler, and on top of the demands made from the Essex rebels, he also wanted more radical demands, such as the confiscation of all church lands and equality of all people. Now, we don't fully know what happened in this meeting, but he may have made these demands, or he supposedly said something disrespectful to Richard. But either way, the mayor of London got up and did not like it and stabbed him. You can't make this up. With their leader being murdered, the Kentish rebels took up their arms, and as royal forces were vastly outnumbered, it looked like the future of the royal family might hang in the balance. But Richard, who's only 14 at the time, rides on his horse into the crowd and supposedly shouted, "You shall have no captain but me," and said that he would give in to all the rebels' demands. This completely diffused the situation, and the rebels began to go home, believing that the king would honour his promises. But it turns out, Richard was a little liar. Within a few weeks, royal troops had marched into Essex and Kent, killing thousands of people and rounded up leaders to be executed. If you remember John Bull, he was hanged, drawn and quartered in the presence of King Richard, and his 4 quarters of his body were sent to 4 different regions of the country to be displayed as a warning. So how do we remember the Peasants Revolt? Well, in the short term, you can look at what happened and say that it was very unsuccessful. Their leaders had been executed, Richard never kept his promises, and this completely failed as a social revolution. The only success really was that the poll tax was never levied again during the medieval period. However, in the long term, we have some really important changes. Given the fact that the rebels had killed the Archbishop, the Treasurer, and destroyed the palace of John of Gaunt, this really struck fear into the ruling classes, and it frightened them. This led to changes in feudal society, as by 1450, about 70 years later, all Valains which were unfree peasants had been granted freedom, and could work for wages wherever they wanted. We also have a sort of political awakening of the lower classes. Previous rebellions in England had been rich and powerful nobles against the king, as we've seen with King John or Simon de Montfort. But here is ordinary people, and it was the first popular uprising in English history, providing inspiration for succeeding rebellions in later centuries. Well, that's it for the medieval period. The next video will jump to the early modern period with the reign of Henry VIII and be looking at a rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace. See you then.